Okay, so I'll put something behind that, stop that moving, stretch the spring out slightly, unhook it, take that out, take out that. But we're getting pretty stripped down here now. I should be able to find out what's going on. Why does this not return? What can be blocking it? There's nothing obviously showing there, so let's get in a bit deeper. Something is physically preventing the blade actuating ring or the blades themselves from returning to the rest position. It's got a number or something written on there, probably a service number of some sort. Let's have this off. I'll remove these last remaining springs from here, I think. One from the B lever, and we'll take the B lever out. And the one on this piece here, which is very good at getting away, so we'll have that off. These are not the ideal tweezers for that, but I think we'll get away with it. That carefully to one side. Okay. And the blade actuating ring will not move. It's jammed, solid. Let's split the case. See where the answer lies. Screws are tight. Okay, and here we have the answer. This, I've said this on many occasions in the past, that a film chip can cripple a camera. That's exactly what's happened in this case. That film chip has found its way into the shutter, it's blocked the action. And because the action's been blocked, the shutter was stuck open and couldn't move. If I put these blades back in position again, I think we'll find that this shutter works. So we'll do that. We'll get the start in the right place. Start here. These blades are a bit oily looking, that certainly needs to be serviced, but that wasn't the reason it stopped. The camera stopped because a film chip blocked the shutter from moving. And the sixth blade, which is the cover blade, goes back over the top of the first blade. How have I managed to do this? Just swing those blades in slightly. This is all a bit sticky. Yeah, it's not going to do it for me. See if I can get the case on there without disturbing anything, and see if those shutter blades will move. No, they're just a bit too sticky with oil. Things aren't, yeah, everything's too gummy. So I can't demonstrate that as easily as I'd like. The mechanism plate here is quite gummy. Just doesn't move smoothly. I'll have one more go, see if I can stack these blades up. I want to demonstrate that this shutter would probably have functioned quite well if it wasn't for that rogue film chip. My toothpick I'm using here to poke things about with is unfortunately not playing the game. These tweezers are no good. Let's find another pair. I'm dropping stuff flat out. Alright, let's see if I can get this shutter reassembled briefly and check that the shutter blades do in fact swing in and out. This is blade number 2. It has a steep cutout in the back to clear that hole there. These blades are very, very greasy for a shutter like this. Greasy shutter blades are quite common in rangefinder type cameras where the lenses are not interchangeable, and so there's limited airflow, if you like, in and out of the shutter. As a result, any oil haze settles inside the shutter rather than dissipating outside in shutters where the lenses are fixed. Of course, the lens is not fixed here. See if I can swing that closed slightly, like that, and get the case over the top. I think we've won. Let's get the screws in and find out. I won't go mad doing these up. I just want to see if those blades will swing in and out smoothly as they should. Well, there you go. So the blades are fine, the shutter's fine. It would have continued working, not in a very good way because that shutter certainly needed to be serviced, but it had a good strong main spring on there. It would have continued to work quite well if it hadn't been for the crippling action of this film chip. And that film chip, yeah, that's just, well, you can see it, it's just a little piece of a chip of film. It's come out of, stripped out between the sprocket holes, and all that did is it got down between the shutter blades, prevented the shutter blades from being able to move, which of course meant that the blade actuating ring was not able to move, and because the blade actuating ring was stuck at the fully blades open position, nothing else would run down, and so nothing else could be cocked. Well, that's interesting. So I'll have that apart again now. Everything here will have to be cleaned. The shutter's off, you know, very obviously oily. The blade actuating ring is very obviously quite stiff. See, this should move very freely, and it just doesn't. It's got a gummy feel to it. So all that's got to come apart, be cleaned. I typically lubricate blade actuating rings with graphite powder. You can certainly use graphite grease or molybdenum paste, as long as you're reasonably sparing with it. Grease has a marvellous tendency to gather up dust over time. It's a magnet for dust, and it thickens up over time too as it loses its volatile components. So what starts off as a nice slippery runny grease ends up being a thick waxy mess. Let's have a look at the case here. Now normally there's nothing controversial about these cases because there's no diaphragm in there. That lives in the lenses. So this plate here is what the shutter blades revolve against on this side. As you can see, there's a lot of dark staining right here. Well, that's corrosion. And it's fingerprints. Someone has gone out of their way to stick their dirty, greasy finger on there, and those fingerprints have etched into the surface. So I'm going to take that plate out. Normally all I do with these is check, particularly in normal cases where there's no great deal of oil on the blades or anything in a shutter of this type. Normally all I do is just wipe this carefully inside and go on my merry way. Usually I would check these 3 screws just to make sure they haven't backed out, come loose, because they will catch on a shutter blade if that's the case. But if it's a greasy shutter, I take that plate off so I can make sure I get out any oils that are trapped underneath it. I'll do that, but this plate, the surface should look like that, except this surface looks like that because it's corroded. Someone's shoved that big greasy fingerprints over that. I'm not even sure that could have been done with that inside the case. Doesn't matter, I'll just brasso that, get that running nice and smooth. And that'll help the shutter blades to move smoothly too. So that's that little mystery solved. We now know what crippled the camera. And the front section here, these often rattle loose. There are 4 screws here, here and here, and quite frequently they come loose. In this case they're nice and tight, there's no problem there at all. But they do come loose. I normally lock those with a touch of lacquer. You've got to be a bit more circumspect with how much lacquer you're throwing around at this one because you don't want any getting underneath the lever. The chrome trim plate on the front here held in place with 3 screws, and this ring round here, which is somewhat devoid of its paint, that's held in underneath here too. So I'm just going to dismantle this lot. This has a particularly oily look. I'm not sure why it should look like that. Get my flash wire out. This piece, yeah, there are those 4 screws. This I'm just going to swab down a bit. That's got a very obvious oily sort of a sheen to that. And I want to get this rubbish off here too. That's the remains of adhesive from the leatherettes on the front of the camera. The adhesive sticks fairly differently depending on what material it's stuck to. So that you saw how much it was clumped up on the aluminium body. Well, it hasn't done that to anywhere near the same extent here on this brass plate. But I will want to get that rubbish scraped off. I'll take this ring off just so I can get into this and clean it a bit more easily. So we've got 4 screws. Now these 2 wheels here have been marked. Someone's put a scribe line across them. If you keep revolving this, they'll get out of step. Now basically the reason you want to keep them in step there is so that you have access to that hole to mount the shutter later on. If it's out, then obviously that's going to be a nuisance. That's all it amounts to. It's a nuisance. It's not impossible. But it's much more convenient if these 2 gears, it's much more convenient if those 2 gears are in a known position, so that you know that that hole is going to be accessible when you want to screw things back together. Okay, so here we've got this to bits. This tab here, this disc, that covers the screw, the adjusting screw for the meter cord on the front of the camera. So this part, all I want to do here is just wipe this down, check that everything moves freely, and it does, so there's no obvious problem there. The setting wheel seems a little bit stiff. I'll flush that out with solvent. You can't get this apart, it's all riveted together. But if you flush out any problems, any thick grease or anything, dust that's got in there, I usually find that a tiny drop of oil here and here, once it's been flushed out and dried, works wonders. But this I'll have to clean. So I'll need to scrape this rubbish off. That's both to get rid of the lumps and bumps, and because the old adhesive is not a known quantity, you don't, if you just glue to the old adhesive, you don't know if the old adhesive is going to let go from the substrate. So you need it all off, because there's no guarantee it'll stay doing its job. Okay, I'll clean this lot up, get that front cleaned, ready for reassembly, then think about diving into the shutter. As you can see, I've been busy cleaning up the body, removed all traces of the old leatherette, got those surfaces nice and smooth. They're ready for the leatherettes to go back on. And the back, the same deal with the back. Now you look at the back there, you can see a lot of discoloration on there, a lot of those dark patches. That's where the corrosion is etched into the aluminium. Each of those patches would correspond to lumps and bumps on the leatherette. I've scraped all the rubbish out of the leatherette, got the insides clean, but you can see the outside, you can see those lumps and bumps. Hopefully I'll be able to get those to go away later, but that's what you get. They would align quite nicely with these patterns that we see here. Yeah, in fact they do. Here and here, here and here, here and here, here and here. All of those patches that telegraph through to the leatherette from the corrosion underneath. But the main thing is I've got this stuff clean. And the first task I've got now is to put the back on the carcass. So I've got 3 screws sorted out. Fortunately they're just the same size screws as hold the base plate on and various other things around the camera. See if I can get these in and stay in shot. That looks good. I'll just tighten those screws up. And the back opens and shuts nicely. That's a bonus. Alright, let's get a few bits and pieces on here I think to start with. And we might just as well start with the tripod socket, I think. That way when I push the thing down on the bench top, the door's not going to be popping open on me all the time, because you can get very tired of that. The arm from the rangefinder's just swinging in underneath the body here and preventing it from sitting flat. Three screws, these are quite long screws, second only to the screws that hold the advance lever on the camera. They're all in place, so I can tighten those up. That's that part. Now the back won't jump open on me when I'm trying to do things. So, might as well put the rewind on here now, I think. This is very simple because there's no inner portion on the rewind, it's just a simple shaft. As I mentioned earlier, that means that the downside with the 3S compared with earlier cameras is that you can't lift the rewind knob slightly in order to get a more comfortable grip on it when you're winding the film back into the cassette. That's obviously not the end of the world, but it's an inconvenience that you can well do without. I think one of my 3S cameras, and I must have 4 or 5 of them. I'm sure I've got good reasons to have 4 or 5. One of them at least, I altered that rewind so that you can raise the rewind knob to wind the film back into the cassette, as on the earlier cameras, as on the folders. Okay, so those two pieces back on the body, that's nice and simple. I want to get the release lever and lock lever back in here now. So I'll just run some molybdenum paste through the holes in the body casting that they run through. And this one where the guide post for the lock lever runs, and on this edge where the spring on the end of the release lever will run. And I'll start with the lock lever. And the lock lever is held in place with a circlip and the spring. Now the spring is lighter wire than its mate, and it's fewer coils. The other one does the release lever. You don't want to mix them up. So I'll put the spring in place, support the lock lever from underneath with my finger, hold the spring down with my thumb from the top. That'll allow me to put the circlip in place, which I'm just carefully picking up with my tweezers out of the picture. Get that in position, and with the tail of my tweezers, just clip that circlip into position. There's the lock lever, moves nice and smoothly. Our release lever. There's a spring on the base of the release lever that keeps it in contact with the cam on the film advance shaft. Now this spring is bent out of shape. That should be pretty much a straight line through there, and it's anything but. Takes off at about 45 degrees, so I'll just get a pair of pliers and straighten that up. Got a good pair of pliers for dealing with things like this. They're round nose pliers. I'm pretty sure they came from some craft shop. They're designed for people to bend up wire for jewellery. But they're just the job for things like this. That spring's a better shape now. That should do the job. All I've got to do, of course, is get it fitted to the release lever. Which sometimes goes very smoothly and other times it does not. Okay. Now that looks good. As you can see, none of that. And I'll fit that to the camera body. Slide it in from the base. Now I want to be careful here not to damage that spring. What the heavier of the two springs we mentioned earlier goes on there, and the screw on the top, that's going into a split shaft, so it's often awkward to get that started. Just seeing what that feels like, because I have in mind that it was a bit loose when we started. It is. That probably won't hold a setting very well there. So what can we do about that? Well, the shaft of course is split. So what I'm going to do is just crush it closed slightly, very slightly, because otherwise I won't get the screw back in it easily. I'll try that. If that's too loose, it won't hold its adjustment, which means that instead of the film advance releasing to allow you to wind on to the next shot at exactly the point in the stroke of the shutter release that the shutter fires, it might release at a different point. If the screw backs out, the film advance might release earlier, earlier. I had it right the first time. That means that if you put your camera up to your eye and you start squeezing the shutter release, but the subject moves or otherwise does something that doesn't entertain you, and you release, take your finger back off the release, you may have already released the film advance. And what that means is that next time you pick the camera up and you check the film advance with your thumb to see if you're wound on, it'll allow you to wind on, and you'll have just wound past a blank frame. Okay, that's better. That's got sufficient tension on it. The take-up spool can go on now. So the bush, metal bush, goes in the take-up spool, goes in the round hole at the bottom, and this goes in the back of the camera, like that. The advance shaft. I need to lubricate this, so I'm going to use graphite grease. We need to make sure we get grease between the bush and the shaft so that it's nice and smooth in its action. And we need some grease in the spring too, so that the coils roll over each other nice and smoothly.